Quick question for my deep thinker friends out there. Does consciousness exist? What do I mean by exist? So, existence is something that can be objectively verified. That means everybody can, in principle, measure it, weigh it, observe it, and so forth. So, when we think about consciousness, is it objective or subjective by nature? Well, consciousness is subjective by nature. It's private. It's an internal feeling. So if my nerves are stimulated, then that will cause or we correlate it to an experience that I have, right? So this experience is only for me. It's not for the world. It's private. So in a sense, consciousness does not exist. So when we think about the hard problem of consciousness, which is definitely a problem for philosophical materialists and physicalists. Part of the issue is that everything they regard as real are things that exist, and things that can be observed objectively are physical objects in the world, objective things. And so, if we're going to be consistent, it seems that you could say consciousness doesn't exist. This is why we don't have proof of consciousness anywhere. There's no measurement. You could say, well, does the thing have a brain? Well, a person who's unconscious could have a brain. Well, they can say, well, we can measure behavior if it can perceive and then interact and navigate in the world. It must be conscious. But a robot toy dog can do that. It can perceive, the solid objects in front of it and then move like a Roomba vacuum cleaner, for example. It perceives and it also navigates through its, space. Is that conscious? Most people would say no. So it's not just perceiving, it's not just navigating, right? So it's really hard to pin down this thing because consciousness is subjective by nature. Science is objective by nature. And then the question is, how can matter, which is presumably unconscious, give rise to a conscious experience? Something intangible like an experience, like a concept. That's the hard question, right? And for all the answers we get, like, well, if you just put enough material things together, placed in just the right way, consciousness will somehow appear. So then we have the demarcation problem. At what point does that happen? At what point does consciousness sort of kick in? Then we have the combination problem. How does just combining a bunch of dead matter cause something like an experience to just appear? No one knows. It's the combination problem. Then, when it comes to like the consciousness of humans and animals, we have the binding problem of the brain, temporal synchrony. In other words, how is it that our vision, our auditory senses, or feelings and things of that nature, why is it all synced up? How does it all sync up? And where does it start? Where does this binding begin? How does it start to begin with? These are all kind of problems, hard problems in consciousness. So, we're given this argument that, well, one day science will figure it all out and then we will understand how all of this works. But it seems that on principle, if consciousness doesn't exist, then what is there even to figure out? How, is there, we could ask, does God exist? You know, God is not measurable in a laboratory. We don't know God's dimensions, his weight, his height, his favorite colors, his favorite taste, his favorite country. We don't know all these things. What's God's favorite flavor of ice cream? We don't know. It's because it doesn't exist. We don't have anything to measure, to interact with like that. But we know consciousness is real because we have experiences all the time. That's how we know it's real. That's why it's a problem to begin with. We know it's real, but it doesn't seem to exist. And a lot of people may say, well, you know, the thing is, consciousness is just stimulation. You know, while the actual experience itself is for the perceiver, there are objective indicators that will show you experience being observed by an external party. Like, when you cut somebody's hand, they scream in pain, or they react somehow to some sort of stimulation. But so what? Does this make the experience not subjective? It still doesn't exist. It's just somebody could be acting that way for all we know. I don't think they are. I agree. Um, when you see someone wince in pain, you could understand that they're experiencing pain, regardless if you are experiencing the pain. And that's true. At least it is for me. And this is what helps us to become compassionate. It's what compassion is all about. And empathy. We can empathize with people because we understand that while consciousness might not exist as an objective thing, it is a reality. So in that sense, I'm a conscious realist. So how does this help us when we want to understand what consciousness really is, the ontology and so forth? Well, all we really have is metaphysics at this point. We have materialism that says consciousness is a byproduct of the brain or some form of matter. But then we run into the hard problem of consciousness and all the other problems I was talking about, right? And then we have idealism, which would say that everything starts with consciousness, and so it's more parsimonious in that way. We have less problems to explain because it's all embedded in consciousness. And a lot of philosophers are growing and sympathetic to that idea. There's panpsychism, which is the idea that consciousness and matter is fundamental. Both of them come together. But we know that matter sort of becomes not matter at a certain point when we measure it. What is it? 10 to the 33 minus 33 centimeters, 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, we can't see because of this thing called gravity. And if you shine enough energy onto a particle to kind of get beyond the 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, you create a black hole. And so you sort of destroy your lab and your building and everything you needed to know what's beyond that point, right? So it doesn't really make a lot of sense. Beyond that is from what I understand in quantum mechanics, would be a probability distribution, potentiality, right? And there's a lot of theories about it, that consciousness actually comes from the quantum world, which is kind of a physicalist theory, depending on how you define physical. But potential things like quantum potential is where the consciousness ultimately derives from. Like Or the Roger Penrose Stuart Hameroff theory, where microtubules in the brain can sort of tap into that energetic state of the universe, that objective state, and from that objective state, once the state is collapsed, a conscious moment appears. Highly theoretical, but there is some evidence to back up its possibility at this point. I think super radiance in the brain is known. Um, and we know that biological systems can exploit quantum tunneling and quantum entanglement, like quantum nodes and photosynthesis, and which uses quantum tunneling, things like that. So a lot of ideas out there about it. Ultimately, I don't know. I'm agnostic on it, but if I had to choose a philosophy that made more sense, I would go with the one that was more parsimonious, a non-dualistic sort of view that doesn't inherit the problems that I listed earlier, like the binding problem, all of these things. If we say consciousness is fundamental, as in idealism, it seems that these problems go away. So it's more parsimonious to say that everything is fundamentally conscious. In other words, when I say something's fundamental, means it doesn't have to be explained in terms of other things. It's kind of like charge, it's fundamental aspect of reality. So that's kind of where I'm leaning. And a lot of people are uncomfortable with this because we are so used to duality. We're used to this thing and that thing. That's what the discriminating mind does. The mind discriminates between this thing and that thing. And it's just hard to understand a non-dual approach to anything, you know. But you have materialistic monists, you know. Those are people who believe that everything is ultimately matter, and that what the brain senses, this idea of separation, all of these things are sort of an illusion. Consciousness is kind of an illusion in that way, which I sort of agree with. I think we can demonstrate that. Um, there are, our minds are limited and they're fragmented off from other minds. I can't experience what other people experience. I don't know what's going on in the Andromeda galaxy. How do I explain that? I would say it's possible that it's kind of like a dream. If consciousness is fundamental, we know one of the modes of consciousness is dreaming. And so it's kind of a relational thing, is how consciousness relates to itself. And so you could say this fractaling off of things gives us the illusion of separation, kind of like consciousness is dreaming. That's a possibility. We see it in the world. We know it firsthand, at least. So in this way, I can make sense of idealism a lot easier than I can make sense of materialism. Now I know that's subjective for everybody. Some people just can't wrap their heads around idealism. It just makes more sense that the world is dualistic, but you have the interaction problem. How does the mind interact with the body? That's another problem. That's on dualism and materialism, or forms of materialism that are dualistic in nature. That interaction problem. So that's kind of why I'm leaning towards idealism. I'd like to hear your opinions in the comments, man. Let me know what you think. Does consciousness exist, and how? And why would you say that? And by the way, like and subscribe to my channel. Trying to grow the channel, trying to create a community of folks who like to talk about these sort of philosophies of mind.